Well, good morning and good afternoon now, and welcome to the second day of SolarFest Live. It's an incredible privilege for us to host this critically important discussion, and we are grateful to have such knowledgeable and dedicated representatives joining us today. Before Bill introduces this conversation, we'd like to thank him. Bill LaBerge is a longtime volunteer at SolarFest and now president of SolarFest, and Grassroots Solar for helping to keep SolarFest vital, vibrant, and growing. Grassroots Solar is Southern Vermont's leading solar and battery backup company. They bring a wealth of knowledge to the intricacies of design, financing, and installing a system for home or business, and will help you choose the best solar system for you. And they're really good folks. So find them at grassrootssolar.com. As the panel begins, please enter your questions or comments into the chat using the button at the bottom of the screen. At the end of the presentation, we hope to have some time for Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill.
All right, thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody who's joining us for day two of SolarFest 2021, and to listen to this discussion on the dynamic state of energy policy. I am delighted to introduce our panel for this discussion today. So joining us from Senator Bernie Sanders' office is Haley Pirro, who will speak to some of the federal policies and see if we can sort out what might be coming in that direction. And then for our discussion on Vermont energy policy, we have Representative Sarah Copeland-Hanzis and Senator Chris Pearson. So they are the leaders of the Vermont Climate Solutions Caucus. And this group really seemed to be getting things moving in this last legislative session. So I'm going to ask Sarah and Chris to start off by talking about the Global Warming Solutions Act overriding the governor's veto to get that passed, and what that means, with the establishment of the Climate Council. What does that mean for energy policy in Vermont? So we start out heading that direction. So Sarah or Chris, I'm not sure which one of you wants to take off, but Sarah, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks so much for putting this together today. It's always a good conversation to talk about energy policy and what we can do here in the state of Vermont, as well as in DC to help accelerate our transition away from fossil fuels. So the Global Warming Solutions Act really is a story of citizen activism. Folks may remember that in 2019, the Climate Solutions Caucus put together a series of roadshow events and traveled all around the state, listening to Vermonters talk about what they want to see in a climate action plan and what they were worried about. And I think one of the most common themes that we heard at these events is you're not being bold enough. You need to go faster. Go forth and do good things. And that kind of sentiment really helped us as we headed into the legislative session in 2020. And, little did we know when we were doing those roadshow events that 2020 was going to throw us a much bigger curveball than any of us could ever have imagined. And for a short period of time, Chris and I worried that, all of the momentum that we'd worked towards was going to be for naught, because people would be too focused on COVID to think about climate. And thankfully, the sentiment really prevailed throughout the legislative session that, yes, we're focused on COVID and COVID recovery, but climate is the next looming disaster and we need to move forward. And so we were able to push through passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act with strong majorities in both the House and the Senate. And then when the governor vetoed the bill, we were able to override that and to do it with the support of constituents from around the state who called up their legislators and said, no, we really need this. We need to move forward. So thank you to those of you who may have reached out to your legislators to help make that happen. And then I think I'll let Chris talk a little bit about where we are now and where we expect we'll go now that Global Warming Solutions Act is law.
Thanks, Sarah and Bill and everybody for having us. So the Global Warming Solutions Act did a few things. It created a council, a broad range of experts from across the state and cross ideologies and expertise of how many, I want to say 23 people forming the Climate Council. It charged them with developing a plan for how Vermont should address the climate emergency, and among some stipulations that it's across sectors, that it has equity principles, that it recognizes our economy, our landscape, et cetera. So a broad directive to come up with a plan. It set emission reduction targets into law that basically hinge the Paris Agreement, get us ultimately to net zero by 2050. And those are requirements in the law. And then maybe most importantly, or covering the whole thing, it creates a citizen right of action so that we are not solely dependent on political leaders to carry out these targets or changes, but rather give citizens a voice to sue the state should we fall short on meeting deadlines, on coming up with aggressive enough plans, et cetera. So an accountability framework that I've been alarmed to see is got everybody on their toes in the way that is what we want in terms of people taking this more seriously than we have in the past. All of that work is coming together now, and in the coming months, we're going to see the Climate Council bring forward their proposed plan and themselves create a public engagement process throughout the fall. The plan is due to the legislature December 1st. That is a very aggressive timeline for the gears of state government to work. We've had to combat, and we're still dealing with a lot of people who are saying, we need more time, this is too rushed. Of course, we're saying, the science says we're really late, we can't have more time. We don't need the perfect senior thesis here. We need a plan to get started, and we can continue to build from that. But what I'd like to help people take away from our discussion here is, if you're interested in, the renewable energy standards or net metering or Hydro-Quebec or any number of our discrete, wind policy, et cetera, that we've battled over the years, those are important and they are discrete battles. What we're about to see handed to the legislature to try to digest in 4.5 months, and in some cases change laws, in some cases fund priorities, and also the administration, the Scott administration, to change rules, is the whole suite. Here's what we need to do in the building thermal space. Here's what we need to do in transportation. Here's what we need to do in agriculture. Here's what we need to do in our public buildings and our blah, 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 transportation, et cetera. The whole thing at once. There's an enormous opportunity here. We actually believe we have federal money that dwarf what we have typically been able to direct to weatherization or what have you in a given legislative year. And we know that the politics of that is going to be very, very tricky. And we need everybody to get ready, start talking now, and help Vermonters not get spooked. If they're, and I don't know the details, none of us know the details, but let's say there's 15 pieces to this plan. 5 of them are going to be effortless. 10 of them we're already doing and we're going to ramp up, and 5 of them are going to be and I'm just making those up, but some number of them are going to be politically very difficult for Democrats and progressives, certainly Republicans in the legislature, and that the governor may struggle with. And they will try to divide us among those things. And they will try to say, well, do you support them all? And that will be very difficult for people. And yet we could assume that we need to do them all. In fact, the harder ones are probably the bigger bang for the buck in terms of emission reduction. And so we all, those of us who are already in this discussion and in this battle, if you like, we need to get our folks ready to shore up legislators, to put a lot of pressure on the administration, because the governor is likely to enjoy watching us squabble and have a political benefit from that. We've got to be vocal in letters to the editor, in Front Porch Forum, and in all those ways that are uncomfortable, lest we miss this opportunity, which is maybe laid out kind of well, with a particular, because we hope that there is federal money that will help us afford a number of these changes. So that's kind of this culmination that's coming forward. We wouldn't have gotten the Global Warming Solutions Act into law without pressure from the grassroots, and we certainly won't get the difficult work that our communities need to undertake without ongoing and amplified pressure from all of you and many more.
Thanks, Chris. I really like the way that you point out how interconnected all of this is. What's really interesting to me is that, all of these issues now, as we electrify our weatherization, our transportation, as we expand broadband, these are all energy issues. Transportation is a technology issue now. So it's interesting how they're all interconnected. And that was a great segue into having Haley come in and just talk to us about when we're talking about the ARPA money and other opportunities that are going. Obviously, there's a budget fight that's going to happen, but Haley, if you could give us an idea of what are we looking at? What's the fight on the federal level, and what can states do? What can the federal government do?
Sure. Thank you, Bill, and thank you for having me here today. For those of you I don't know, my name is Haley Perro, and I do outreach for Senator Sanders here in Vermont on energy issues. So as you said, there's kind of a few different things in play. As we know, ARPA passed and really directed unprecedented amounts of funding to a variety of things to help us recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And it really included historic direct funding to states and localities in a way we haven't seen in over a generation. And what we also saw was it was really popular with the American people. It really showed them kind of in a moment of crises that the federal government could be of assistance. So that was really important to Bernie to get that direct aid to folks. Looking ahead, infrastructure is probably what you've heard about most at the federal level. And, what does infrastructure mean is a big open question for a lot of folks. So what's in play now is a bipartisan infrastructure bill that's being considered by the Senate. And that really includes a lot of what we think of for traditional infrastructure. So roads, bridges, water infrastructure, really that physical infrastructure. And while that's absolutely important and must get funded and has long been something that Bernie's pushed for substantial federal funding for, Senator Sanders and his colleagues on the Budget Committee, where he's currently chair, they really think we've got to think more holistically about what infrastructure is and what we need kind of as the backbone of our society to be successful and have people thrive. And again, kind of in this very unique historic point where we're just coming out of a pandemic, how can we set people up for success, particularly those who might not have been able to succeed during the pandemic? So, whether that's childcare accessibility and affordability, whether it's pre-K, whether that's expanding Medicare. And of course, probably very top of mind for the folks on this discussion is really the existential threat of climate change and how we can address that, make our current infrastructure and future infrastructure more resilient to climate, but also really attack the problem itself. So we have that bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then Senator Sanders has really fought hard for a really big, bold investment in a broader, more holistic view of infrastructure. Right now, it's a $3.5 trillion package. You may also hear it called the reconciliation package. Not to delve too far into the weeds, but the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan one, will be passed through regular order. And reconciliation is a special tool that we have in the Senate, and Bernie would be involved as chair of the Budget Committee in being able to pass legislation with a 51 vote majority. That would be something that we've used for ARPA, for instance, for Trump's tax cuts, for affordable care. So it's something that Bernie will be very involved in. And, it can get very procedural about what can be included there. But I think what Bernie is really focused on too is less about the procedure and the process, as important as that is, but also really, again, what the impacts will be on everyday Vermonters, everyday families across the country, and how we can make sure that it's really consequential and, again, really matches the moment of where we are and the needs we have. And again, a lot of focus on climate. What those details are certainly unclear. I'll just wrap up by saying next steps will be kind of, moving forward with bipartisan infrastructure bill, but then also the Budget Committee will be working on budget resolution. And that kind of gives a big kind of top line numbers for these big priorities. And then they'll give reconciliation instructions to each Senate committee and saying, spend X amount of dollars, achieve these goals. And then that's really where the legislative details will be worked out. So we're still very much in a moment in flux, but it's a really exciting opportunity. And again, Bernie really, really wants to be bold with this.
Thanks, Haley. Thanks for bringing up the infrastructure. I'd like to segue. There's a number of topics that we can hit, and I would like to start out with a little bit of infrastructure discussion. As an EV adopter, early adopter, my wife and I now have eliminated fossil fuels from our property, and so we are fully EV. And infrastructure is an important discussion. I had to drive up into the Northeast Kingdom last weekend. And, our Nissan Leaf has 265-mile range and it's 140 miles. So you can do the math. We had to stop somewhere and when you get up into the Northeast Kingdom and you pull out your app, if you have some reception, and you start looking around for, DC fast chargers, they are few and far between. So infrastructure is really important discussion going on right now. So I'd love Chris and Sarah, if you could touch on what is happening right now. Obviously, there's going to be recommendations, there's going to be money coming in, but where is Vermont focusing on? There's a number of topics that we could discuss with EVs. The charging infrastructure, low to moderate income access. That it's a technology, and so I'd love for you guys to start talking about EVs and the transportation side of the energy.
Yeah, Chris sits on a committee that touches on energy policy, so I'll let him get into some of the technical aspects of it. But one thing that has really occurred to me as I have watched more and more of my neighbors adopt EVs is that the way you refuel your vehicle is different, right? And so it might, until folks get used to it, and until we get the infrastructure as widespread and evenly spaced as possible, it's just going to take folks a little bit of extra planning to figure out how to take those longer trips with their EV. And it's kind of a fun adventure, especially if you have the app and can sort of plan out your trip based on where you're going to stop for 20 minutes and look around a new community that you've never been in before. So yeah, I mean, clearly we have a long way to go in terms of helping Vermonters adapt to and adopt that technology. And it's really heartening to see the new options that are coming out from the manufacturers. The fact that an electric pickup truck is available is something that I think is very appealing to a lot of folks who need a truck to get around. And so, Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about your view of the EV infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, we have no question a long way to go. In an exercise of data and statistics, I saw a headline the other day that boasted Vermont has the most charging per capita. But I'm going to guess that's not per square mile, right? So, good for us per capita, but that doesn't help you when you're way out in the deep woods of Vermont. So we have a lot of work to do. There is good news. First of all, we have been making these investments. We need to amplify them. We are also, and this is sort of nitty gritty, but this is a nitty gritty group. The way you deal with that electricity coming off of the lines and sell them through a charging station, for instance, has not been straightforward. In Vermont, historically, entities that sell electricity are utilities. Well, what happens if you open a for-profit charging station? So the legislature and the Public Utility Commission have been chewing through that, coming up with clarity. This will, and is sort of closing that process now. This should accelerate people who are in the business of creating charging infrastructure. So that's a good thing. We have actually, in this case, a governor who's quite enthusiastic about electric vehicles. He's a car guy, right? We know this. So I actually have some faith that he will be a good partner and driving the Agency of Transportation on this issue. We also have made some changes because electric cars are not sold always in the same model of the local dealership. Tesla, for instance, doesn't have dealerships, and there have been old laws that block Ford, as an example, from competing with Joe's Ford dealership. And those sort of, the mechanics of that had to be addressed. So anyone that owns a Tesla, and they're only one example, but they're the high profile example, had to take it to Albany or West Lebanon to get it fixed. We changed that, and we understand there's potential for a service center here in Vermont. This is good jobs. When we talk about green jobs, you know, we need to be more than just catering to Tesla owners, but that's a part of it. We need these early adopters. So there's some of that is coming. We've also been investing in recognizing that it's not all about EVs, although that's where we need to go. If you get, and particularly for our neighbors who are of lower income, getting out of a car that gets 16 miles to the gallon and into a car that gets 32 miles to the gallon is very positive for them and for climate. And so we have been investing in swap out programs that aren't driving people to EVs, but shifting them into more efficient vehicles. So a lot of that has been happening. With more money, I think we will do it more. And this comes back to the federal funding. Also, we need to talk, if we're talking about transportation issues, about TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is potentially 13, 14 states from Maine over to New York down into Virginia, coming together like we've done around electricity and the RGGI, if folks are familiar, basically a regional kind of cap and trade of some kind that would help drive money coming into the state, help reflect closer or more so the true cost of gasoline, and have us get a source of revenue to make some of these investments. TCI is being sort of worked out. Vermont's at the table, but as of now, the governor has not said, yes, we'll do it. And other states have. We need the governor to make that declaration and formalize our involvement with TCI, in my opinion. So a lot is happening, way more to go. More money will make it easier, and that's where Haley comes in.
And Haley, would you like to speak about transportation initiatives?
Sure. So I would mention that as part of the bipartisan bill that's being worked on, the title that comes out of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which Bernie is on, has passed. I've taken a kind of a quick glance at it because who knows what will end up in the final bill. There's certainly discussion of EVs and EV charging infrastructure in that, but it's pretty minimal. A lot of the focus is on the electric, transmission and grid infrastructure, which is important kind of overall to EVs, of course. Funding for storage, funding for, helping to kind of accelerate manufacturing of EVs. So I think there's some hope there, but similarly, I would say kind of more broadly speaking to as what we're seeing in Vermont, I think President Biden is very interested in having EV funding, both for the charging infrastructure and EVs themselves. And Senator Sanders very much so as well. He actually drove an EV recently, kind of, got to talk to a dealership and see what it's like for the average Vermonter to walk in, learn about the incentives, which are, quite good, but need to be better, and could really benefit from having more federal funding backing them up. So I would say that's very much in the mix, particularly for reconciliation. Is something that is going to be a priority if we don't get it in there. We can always have standalone bills as well. So I feel relatively confident as you can about anything in DC, that we will see some federal support for EVs and charging infrastructure.
Yeah, one interesting aspect that I know has been brought up, and I'm not sure if the discussion has gone anywhere very far with this, is there are some unintended consequences with turning your entire fleet into electric vehicles. One of them is car mechanics no longer have anything to do. There's no transmissions, there's no exhaust, so they literally take my car to have my snow tires put on and taken off. So one thing is, job training is going to be necessary. But the other big one is the highway funds right now are funded by a gas tax. And so I don't know, Chris or Haley, if you've heard any discussions where that's going in terms of how do we shift that over? Because as we shift to electric vehicles, that gas tax is no longer coming in. So have you heard anything about where that's going to go?
Haley, take it away.
I was just going to say the same to you. I should have checked with my transportation colleague earlier. I don't have much to add to that at the federal level, unfortunately.
A lot of the state money that comes in is at the pumps, as you say, Bill. And basically, a lot of us have been wrestling with a solution. There are experts who say you shouldn't put the solution in place until there's a bit more of a critical mass of electric vehicles. Some people say 15% of the fleet. I need to be convinced of that wisdom. But one of the things that I've heard broad agreement on is we should understand the system, the mechanics for making sure EV owners pay their fair share, even if there's some time before we enact it. Because, you are paying your fair share of the purchase. What do we call it? When you register your EV, you're paying a tax then, just like a fossil fuel car. But as you say, the road maintenance and those budgets are already overwhelmed, with our increase in flooding and rain damage and storm damage, which is intensified because of the climate crisis. We're seeing those budgets not stretch as far. So we're already, and you don't want to set up or exacerbate an us and them, the electric car owners are getting away free. That's a bad political dynamic that we should avoid. We should clearly avoid. And so we're wrestling through that. There's talk of, do you do sort of every year when you get your inspection, somebody looks at your odometer and then there's a per mile, an assessment that way. That would put different kind of pressure on the inspection mechanics. But that's one of the ideas that's come through. Or similarly, in your annual renewal through the DMV, that's probably the point where you would gather some kind of fee or tax so that electric vehicles are paying their fair share. In the grand scheme of all we have to tackle, this one won't be that hard, but we do need to get that together, and people are working on that even now.
So then that leads us to, it's interesting because my wife and I got our solar, then we got our heat pumps and our electric cars. And what's happening now, we're finding as a solar installer, I'm getting phone calls from people who are getting the EV and they're calling me up and say, hey, I got an EV, I need solar panels. So I'm going to go the same way. I'm going to lead us from the discussion about electric vehicles into renewable energy. And I understand that is a massively wide topic, and I'm we could talk about that for several hours. But Haley, we've already had someone ask if any update on the ITC, the income tax credit, whether that's going to be extended federally, et cetera. So I could have you start off to talk about that, and then at the state level, we can start to talk about what's going on statewide.
Sure. So I think, renewable energy credits, tax credits at the federal level across the board are something that there's pretty broad interest. And when I say broad interest, I'm not necessarily speaking of the Republican caucus, but among Democrats who we need to have on board for reconciliation. So I think that folks just really have seen how that's really, expanded the market, and what we've seen, even in states like Vermont, as the ITC has stepped down. I've certainly heard from solar installers around the state and kind of the impact they're seeing. So certainly it's something that Senator Sanders supports. Back in 2015, he actually introduced a bill not only to make those tax credits like the solar ITC permanent, but also to make them refundable, because that's a concern we hear a lot, that it's all well and good to have a federal tax credit, but if you are a senior on Social Security, if you're a low-income Vermonter, you're really being left behind there. And that's something that, as we're developing tax policy, we need to be thinking about. How can we make sure that we're incentivizing storage and solar and all the technologies, and really doing that so it's accessible to everyone. So I'm relatively hopeful that that's something we will be able to address through reconciliation. Again, not being the expert, we have a whole team of experts in DC who get to figure out what can be put through reconciliation because of some of kind of the Senate procedural issues there. But I think a lot of momentum and interest there, particularly on the solar ITC, and absolutely from Bernie, something he'll be pushing. Really just, again, seeing firsthand the benefits of what it means for a working family if they can go solar, if the upfront costs are minimal and affordable, and really that long-term benefit to them as a homeowner to have those solar panels on their roof, and obviously the greater benefit as well with distributed generation and to utilities and the state.
Yeah, I know Bernie early on was he helping to sponsor the idea, and it was actually bipartisan support for turning that income tax credit into a rebate or some other program so that, lower moderate income people can access it, and retirees, et cetera, nonprofits. So we thank him for his support on that. He also was an early supporter of an ITC for storage separate, because right now people can get the income tax credit if they do storage with their solar. And he said, let's do it, even if it's just for battery, because businesses can use batteries for peak shaving. So we support him on a lot of that. In Vermont, we're interesting situation that we're in is that Green Mountain Power we're starting to see net metering disappear. And I remember doing a presentation a couple of years ago in Royalton, and one spokesperson for Green Mountain Power was in the audience, and I had on my slide, well, net metering is going away. And she started shaking her head. That's not true. Well, now it is. So as of September 1st, net metering is going to be worth every kilowatt hour that you generate is going to be worth a penny less than retail. So now they're starting to come in with negative incentives. Those are called disincentives. It's still an incentive, but it's going down. So, Chris, Sarah, is there anything we can do in that discussion that may be a regulatory thing? I'm not exactly sure, but it seems to me that a state that wants to get to 90% renewable by 2050 is biting off its nose to spite its face. And I'd love to hear if there's something we can do about that, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm going to kick it over to Chris pretty quickly because, again, he's got more policy experience with this in his Senate Finance Committee. But I would just acknowledge here with this group of really focused and committed people that, the regulatory scheme around pricing that impacts net metering is really kind of like an onion, and it's very challenging for us to peel away enough layers of that onion that our constituents, could understand what it takes to make some of the deeper, bigger reforms that might be necessary. And so I think, it is likely that this sort of change is going to need to be undertaken with direction from the executive branch, who have folks who are on the job year round, who have access to experts to advise them. And a citizen legislature that, meets January through May it's going to see a lot of challenges in being able to undertake some of the more complicated reforms around energy policy. But Chris, you feel free to disagree with me.
No, I agree. In terms of the specifics, the way I think about it is this, and Bill, I want to understand more of the details you're sharing, because I hadn't heard specific. I know it gets adjusted the way that we pay for net metering. The way I think of it is this: roughly 2007, 2008. There was a whole push in the legislature to figure out local renewable energy, and we came up with the standard offer, and we started the net metering process. And they were both in some ways generous to renewable developers and to people that wanted renewable energy. And nobody knew, will 2 people do this? Will 4,000 people do this? They just didn't know. It was very, very new. Well, it exploded, right? Not people here won't be surprised. The legislature had not fully understood how important the climate emergency was to Vermonters. We were, that was, and that was 12, 15 years ago. People in Vermont understood this threat and gobbled it up, right? And so it exploded. Now that you might say we were a victim of our own success, and it had to be ratcheted back because it was potentially having an impact on everybody's electric rates. And it started creating an us against them. Why should I pay more for you to have solar panels on your house when I don't have mine, goes the argument. So the legislature would nibble at this and make adjustments, and eventually said, this is crazy. This is a dynamic, ever-changing universe of costs, and the prices of solar panels themselves and infrastructure is coming down. And so we said, the PUC, you have the expertise. We set up an ability for them to refresh rates periodically. Now, some have been very critical, and myself included, that they have really brought it down too far. But we do, I think we're still landing at roughly about 14 cents a kilowatt hour. And you can make a solar farm for 11 cents a kilowatt hour, or, I don't know exactly where it pencils out, but this is tricky. We still, I don't believe anybody is threatening the idea of rooftop solar for homes, and that can basically, maintain on a basically preserving your annual budget of electric rates, what you're paying now, the sort of SunCommon model. I think that still works. Those are still being installed. What we're seeing is a couple of other dynamics. The larger installations, the group net metering, some of these have clearly hit rocky waters, and we're coming up against our grid. Our grid is not, putting a solar farm just anywhere in the state does not necessarily make sense. We need to be more tactical about the resilience of our grid. There is too much generation, particularly while we watch Hydro-Quebec coming in the northern part of the state. There's too much generation there. There's not enough in the south. And so we have to start aligning incentives for the geolocation of where it makes sense. We did this year figure out the regulation of taxing on storage. We're seeing those pop up on the grid. This is great. This will better enable us to fully utilize solar in particular. And we created some certainty so that developers and others can do that. So this is a wrestling. This is ongoing. Those of us that want to see more power generated locally in small, locally controlled fashion have a lot of work to do to convince others that that's what our standard should be, and that we can't keep pretending Hydro-Quebec is just as valuable to a renewable market as a solar array or wind, or frankly, a digester. So there's a lot of work to do. It's not perfect. I would not back up the statement that Green Mountain Power is halting net metering. I think there is an adjustment to make it more equitable. I suppose we will argue whether it's enough or too much, and those details I have yet to understand fully.
Yeah, no, I've been part of a lot of the testimony in front of various committees and talking about, whether there's a cost shift. Those of us who have solar are getting a free ride, and those who don't have solar have to pay for all the repairs. And we could go into, we could have this discussion for 2 hours. The cost shift absolutely goes both ways. And, if they're paying me 20 cents for every kilowatt hour I generate, they don't have to buy it from Ohio for $1.25, which is exactly what they're doing today. You can look at the live thing. So yeah, it's an interesting discussion. And so then that leads to, grid modernization. I'm jumping all over the place here. Greenhouse gas emissions, I'd love to chat about, but grid modernization, that was one of the big things that the previous Climate Action Committee had come up with as one of the things we need to do. We're trying to develop resilience in this state, fighting climate change. So Sarah, can you talk about where, as we're building resilience in our communities? I know there's a resiliency subcommittee that's going to be reporting out, but it seems to me that we have to develop a plan. To me, that involves less centralized, power generating grids. It's more local solar and batteries, et cetera. But that's what I do for a living. So can you talk about just resiliency and throw grid modernization in there as well?
Yeah, I think the theme on this is similar to what I said in answer to your last topic, which was these are really complicated regulatory structures that don't easily lend themselves to the legislature coming in and crafting the solution that we need. I think the fact that you all identified this as members of Governor Scott's Climate Action Commission in 2017, 2018 really points to the fact that we know that this is a looming challenge for us. It's not unique to Vermont. Our grid is not set up for the way we will be powering our lives in the future. But this is something that, the governor needs to direct his Department of Public Service to get working on, because we aren't going to craft that here as legislators. We understand the challenges, but the complexity of the solution really needs to be a collaboration between us.
And I would just jump in here and pick on the Public Service Department. For years, they have come in whenever I've and others have said, we got to be 100% renewable. Here's the timeline we should do. We got to build more small, local, regenerative, renewable sources. They'll say, well, the grid's not ready. We can't do it just any old place on the grid. And I said, well, fine. Tell us where to do it. We got, and literally we're in the room with 5 developers that would love to go do that or put in bids to do that. And the Public Service Department is sort of, oh, shucks, well, we don't. It really is pathetic. And we have to put pressure, in this case, squarely on the governor. This is, we are exporting millions, hundreds of millions of dollars every year as a state to buy energy from out of state. There's no reason we shouldn't do that here in a way that beefs up our local economy, creates a stronger grid, has a greener grid, et cetera, et cetera. Without a green grid, all the EVs in the state are meaningless. Charging your electric car with a natural gas electric source is actually inefficient. You should just probably burn gasoline. So we have got to get this right. And along the way, we should be able to create local, beef up our local economy and ultimately save Vermonters money. So there's a lot to like here, but piecing it all together takes real leadership, political leadership that a lot of us have tried in the legislature, but we're kind of a clunky entity to pull that off. And without direction coming from the Public Service Department in particular, it's proven tricky. Interrupted by COVID certainly made it harder.
Yeah, then that'll lead to a nice segue to discuss greenhouse gas emissions, and part of that being the externalities that you were just discussing that are never taken into the equation. So we have the utility that Green Mountain Power that is getting its renewable energy from Hydro-Quebec. Some would argue that they aren't counting the greenhouse gas emissions from up in Canada. They're taking over Indigenous people's lands, and so there's those externality costs, there's those emissions, and they're not being counted. And then the transportation of energy sources that you were just describing. And I think Dave just added in the chat, that why is this argument rarely raised that the cost of conventional energy is so heavily subsidized by increased health costs, nation security costs, et cetera. To me, this is a huge issue. And Haley, I know that Bernie has brought this up to try and level the playing field, to talk about taking away some of the subsidies for oil companies, or at least help make them pay for some of those externalities.
So I would just mention that, right, Senator Sanders has introduced the End Polluter Welfare Act. A lot of folks say that renewables are so expensive and how can we ever afford to transition to them? But as you're saying, we just try to find all the subsidies that fossil fuel industries get. And that was challenging because they're so baked in so many ways. But it's huge. So it's really not a fair comparison when you're looking at the costs. So that's certainly something that we'd like to see, is to end that polluter welfare, exactly as we call it. And just, if you don't mind jumping off of what I saw, one of the comments or questions in the chat is really, what about the workforce as we sort of transition away from fossil fuels? And I think that's really important to think about. And a lot of what we hear about, concerns, what will happen to these folks. And that's something that we've looked at in the past in our office, and it's really part of a pretty active discussion now as we look ahead to this kind of major infusion of federal funding. So previously, Bernie has looked at how we can have a just transition, particularly looking at coal country, for instance, and really how we get those workers to be brought along through the transformation and transition to clean energy. And really, I think a lot of that is going to be in retraining, but also in investments in communities. So we're not leaving, for instance, coal country behind, but instead, investing with economic development and really seeing, again, this as an opportunity to create well-paying jobs for folks. And more broadly speaking now, we're looking at, climate conservation corps and kind of inspiring a whole new generation of folks who are interested not just in conservation in the typical way that we've thought of the CCC, but also in these clean energy jobs that are paid well, kind of have all the supports you need to be a successful person in the workforce. And I think there really is a lot of momentum there and a lot of consensus among the Democratic caucus. There's a number of proposals out. I think there's 5 total. The senators support at least 2 of those. So, we're really hopeful that that'll make it across the finish line.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out all of those aspects. I will actually steal this. If anybody who's watching wants to see the Climate Solutions Caucus and their meetings, you can see Chris and Sarah, in their witty repartee. It's on Facebook, it's on YouTube, and I'm going to steal this one from Sarah when she was talking about the 3 wins. And we have this opportunity to stimulate the economy, to save people lots of money, and to create jobs. And I would add the 4th win, which is the environmental benefits, to help save the planet. So these are, we do have a tremendous opportunity as we shift. We made the shift from the horse and buggy to the internal combustion engine. And everybody said, no, they're going to go too fast. They're going to kill people. They're going to be noisy. And that was all true. And we did it just fine. And now we've made the transition to this. We've pulled the plug on that. We've pulled the cord. So now we've got these batteries helping us out. And so they are tremendous opportunities, as you're saying. Sarah, do you want to riff on that, since I stole your line from your video?
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up, because it really is the way we try to frame our thinking in terms of the ideas that we're going to put forward, we're looking for solutions, which is why we call ourselves the Climate Solutions Caucus. And we're looking for things that work in a rural state for stimulating the economy and saving folks money. I think the only riff that I'd like to make off of that is that while folks are poking around looking for some of the recordings of the Climate Solutions Caucus, I would also, welcome you to look at the Climate Council and their subcommittee meetings right now. All of them are done virtually and are streamed and recorded. I would, folks who really like to get into the weeds of, sort of the future of our energy adaptations, tune into the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. You want to go to the Agency of Administration website, which you can probably find in your search engine, and take a peek at what's going on in the council, because in some ways it's really heartening to see, wow, there's all of these really great conversations that are happening as a result of the work that you helped us do in passing the Global Warming Solutions Act over the objection of the governor. But in some ways it's also really daunting to see how how complex this is, and see the steps that are appearing to happen to slow things down. We don't have time to wait. We don't have time to waste. We could pick up the 2017 report of the Climate Action Commission and dust off those recommendations, but we certainly hope that the Climate Council brings us some actionable steps. And as Chris said, some of them will be easy, simply continuing or doing more of what we've already been doing. And others of them are going to be more challenging. So if folks start tuning in now to the work of the council, that'll help us all get up to speed for what we need to do in January.
Yeah, Chris just posted the link to the Climate Council, but Annette also pointed out that tomorrow morning we're going to be hearing, the council is going to be hearing from presentations from all of the subcommittees. So she provided a link in the chat. People can join in. I believe there's even a time for some public comment during that. So so you can really see the presentations that are coming and see the work that's being done. And I did want to, there's one question just talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and let me get to the exact wording so that I don't mess that up. But it's interesting to see we've been doing all this work lately, and it seems like we're not lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. And what are we going to do? It seems like the work that we're doing should be leading to a great drop off. And I don't know if it was, COVID, what happened with COVID last year, but it seems to me that greenhouse gas emissions have not gone down as quickly as we would like to see. And I don't know if
they are declining, but nowhere near quick enough. And in fact, by New England standards, we're well behind our peer states in terms of per person emissions and in terms of our decrease. That was one of the compelling dynamics we were able to help get our colleagues on board. I would just say in the pandemic, we've had a lot of elements that give me heart, that embolden me to believe we may be able to tackle this crisis as a community. We had a clear problem statement. We had clear leadership from the governor and other political leaders. And we came together as a community and we basically said, we're doing this. And as a small communities, a lot of the elements of taking care of our neighbor, of making sure food was available to people that need it, a lot of these elements are akin to what we're going to need to do in a sustainable future, where we sort of relocalize and maybe don't think of tomatoes coming from California, but instead wonder where we could get them within 10 miles, right? The food movement in Vermont is up one of the planks of a sustainable future. There's a lot of reason to think that we can do this. The challenge becomes those who the economy have left behind historically, need to be part of this solution. The challenge to me becomes everybody agreeing on the problem statement and then rolling up our sleeves to work together, because we are not going to decrease emissions if we keep driving everywhere and keep heating our homes the same way we've been doing. Those are big habitual changes, habit changes that we need to ask and help Vermonters make. And we need to pull together and help people have a sense of community as a part of the motivation here, the way we have through COVID. And I'm only hoping we can draw from the strength that we've had through the pandemic.
Yeah, one thing that I have noticed in all of these discussions, whether it's nationally or statewide, is a real, climate justice, environmental justice, access. As I'm working with a group bringing in a regenerative food network, and even in that discussion, food access, healthcare access. I mean, I think that's one thing that has made me feel really positive about a lot of the developments lately is a real focus on that. Mike Bailey, just wanted to say, what are the states, countries, or municipalities you look to as providing a good example? What's a good example of a good way forward?
Well, we don't all jump in at once. This is one of the challenges, Mike. There's no one that you can just replicate. Say they're nailing it, we'll do that here. You have to, I think, take little examples from across the board and utilize what's worked. Massachusetts has seen a good decline in emissions, but they closed a lot of coal plants. That's not something we can do here, right? So there's a really nuanced and community by community interpretation, I think, of what this has to mean.
And I would just jump in quickly and say that, we know that Vermont has a long, long way to go. I think Bernie often points to Vermont and really the wins that we have here, because sadly, a lot of other states, really aren't taking this nearly as seriously and working as collaboratively as people here are in Vermont. So it is heartening when, on the Senate floor, that Senator Sanders can point to utilities in Vermont that are 100% renewable, or really great, solar projects, and a host of other things. So I just wanted to say a thank you to Vermonters for that.
Yeah, and I will double that because, back in the day, in the before times when we used to go to conferences, I would be at a conference and of course, all the installers are asking, where are you from? Where are you from? And I'd say Vermont. Oh, that's great. You're renewable, you're green. And so while that is, a lot of that is true, we have a lot of work to do. So I really appreciate the work that Representative Sarah Copeland-Hanzis and Senator Chris Pearson you're doing. And thank you, Haley, for joining in. I know that Bernie is always plugged into what is going on and what we need to do going forward. So I appreciate everybody coming in today. We have reached the end of our time, and I think we handled most of the questions. Some of them we didn't get to, and I apologize for that, but we could really go on for hours, but our time has come up. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.